right, everybody, we are back. I am Jack Murphy. This is Jack Murphy Live Show, episode number 91 coming at you today. It's been a nice little cluster of episodes coming out. I'm really excited today about our guest, David Goldman. He is the deputy editor of the Asia Times. He's also a Claremont fellow. Got a wide range of interests, a lot of expertise in a number of areas. But today we're going to talk about specifically Russia and Ukraine. He's been on top of this for quite some time, writing a number of articles, keeping us abreast of the real deal of what's going on inside Russia and the Russian-Ukraine war. We're going to talk about China, talk about foreign policy in general, including a notable Claremonter, Angelo Codevilla. He's got a great book out now about the rise and fall of America in the foreign policy universe, using John Quincy Adams as a great framework to understand America first and how preposterous that notion is even. So it's going to be a good talk. Follow me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. Subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. Hit subscribe to your podcast software. And if you're interested in masculinity, brotherhood, and sovereignty, come check out the Liminal Order. That's liminal-order.com, a nationwide network of men, like-minded men, doing the things that we need to do in order to fight back against what's going on out there, support each other. A lot of good stuff going on. That's liminal-order.com. And without further ado, here we go. David Goldman. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm great. And Jack, it's an honor to be speaking with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I know you got a lot going on. You're the editor at the Asia Times. You're writing. I see you writing for PJ Media all the time. You're a fellow with the Claremont Institute. You worked on the street up in New York. You're an expert in a number of areas that I find to be very interesting, including finance, foreign policy, and the like. And so I'm ready to just get into it. You and I, even though we have a number of mutual friends in common, we haven't met. So I'm interested just to get maybe a couple minutes on your background so we can ease this conversation and give everybody the comfort that we're talking to somebody who knows what they are talking about. So I appreciate that. David, just give us a little bit of a background on you so that we can segue into the content here.
Well, I'm an old Ronald Reagan hawk. I consulted for National Security Council in the first Reagan administration, mainly on economics, and I stumbled into Wall Street. I'd been working for one of the supply side consulting firms back in the Reagan Revolution days. And I ended up working at Bear Stearns, Credit Suisse, Bank of America, mainly in research, mainly in, of all things, fixed income research, getting inside the clockworks of how our financial system gets so screwed up and how bubbles get created and how people's savings get ruined by crooks and things like that. I finally couldn't stand it anymore in 2005, and I quit Bank of America. Ended up working for a boutique in Hong Kong that was Chinese-owned, called Reorient Group. It was bought by Jack Ma, and in the 5 years that I worked for it, I saw a bunch of things from the inside of what China was doing that made my eyes pop out, like in the cartoons. So, although I am certainly no China expert, I'm just a quick study, I spent a lot of time with a privileged view of what I call China's plan to Sino-form the world, make the world into a bigger China. I wrote a book about it called You Will Be Assimilated, like the Borg in Star Trek. And since Jack Ma took the firm over, I've been mainly working for Asia Times, which is the largest English language news platform dealing with pan-Asian news. And I'm become increasingly alarmed at, number one, the determination of the Chinese to become the dominant world player, and secondly, the utter cluelessness with which the United States has approached the strategic rivalry with China.
Yeah, with well, first off, fixed income was my passion too. It's sort of a weird, obscure thing, but once you get into it, you realize like the entire world filters down into those interest rates. And being a polymath and widely educated and understanding political economy, economics, finance, trade flows, all kinds of stuff really filters down into that one number. And it's a fascinating experience, super mathy also, if I remember. But on China's grand strategy. That's a great place to start. And our grand strategy for engaging with China. I've had John Robb on the show a number of times, and he is a former special forces guy and an analyst, an entrepreneur, a technologist, and he sees the world pretty clearly. We've had a number of discussions about our failed grand strategy with China, and I keep coming back to the late '90s and the WTO admittance of allowing China into the WTO. And back then, I was at Georgetown School of Foreign Service getting a master's degree there, and they said the embrace of death was the way to go. That they were going to embrace China, bring them into the world order, and in doing so, we were going to share our democratic and liberal views with them, and they would then come to see the world our way and join us hand in hand, skipping down the economic path to riches. How's that grand strategy working out for us?
Well, that's been an absolute catastrophe. China's had an emperor for 3,000 years, maybe more. They see no reason why they should change their system now. The culture is so different that I try to describe it in science fiction terms instead of conventional political science categories. If you will, the Russians are the Romulans and the Chinese are the Borg.
Mm.
They have, their view is there's no such thing as China. It's not a nation. It simply is civilization. They have a civilizational approach into which they wish to absorb their neighbors and ultimately the rest of the world. The rest of us are barbarians. The idea that the Chinese want to come in and impose a communist party system on the United States of America is a fantasy. They're not like the Russians, who had a messianic mission to spread world communism. The Chinese are incurious about how we barbarians govern our affairs. They want us to pay tribute to them. They want to be stronger. They want to dominate us. They want to exact rents from us. They want to make us submit. They have no interest in ruling us or anyone else because they don't think we're clever enough or civilized enough to be ruled like Chinese. And the key to China's global ambitions is to dominate what China likes to call the fourth industrial revolution. That's a concept they picked up from the World Economic Forum in Davos, which loosely means the application of artificial intelligence to automate vast numbers of processes and achieve productivity gains which were hitherto unimaginable. And they've made a lot of progress in that direction. The fact they dominate 5G broadband is a critical thing. We made a lot of effort to keep Huawei and ZTE and other Chinese companies out of the American market for 5G. But we also have 5G, which is really just 4G LTE with a different label stuck on it, whereas the Chinese have 5G, which is several times faster than ours. And they already have things like automated autonomous taxi services, automated ports, automated warehouses. You go to a Chinese warehouse, you don't see anybody on the floor except, the occasional supervisor or repairman. Everything's done by robots. You go to a Chinese port, there's nobody on the long shore. A few guys in bubbles with joysticks just checking that the automated cranes are picking the right containers up using barcodes or embedded chips, putting them into autonomous trucks, taking them to warehouses where they're going to be emptied by robots and have their packages sent on by robots. And if this continues, if China dominates the fourth industrial revolution, remember China already has 30% of world industrial production. We have 15%. So their industrial weight is now double ours, and the gap is expanding. They'll control high-tech manufacturing, and we're going to be Brazil to China, selling energy and raw materials and soybeans and stuff like that, and totally dependent on them. And militarily, we will be inferior because with high-tech industrial base ultimately comes military power. It's a very scary prospect, and we have done what we've done so far has really not slowed them down very much at all.
No, as a matter of fact, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how we've handed them this. We've begun the process of turning ourselves into a colony of theirs, and in doing so, or in the way we did that is by offshoring all of our manufacturing and just letting them into our system, inviting them into our hen house, and just saying basically take everything, right? And this was all done with the look. Was it a lie? Was it a mistake? I don't know, but we were deceived, right? When they said, hey, we'll just go to China, we'll make cheap stuff, everybody in America will be richer.
Oh, it's what we wanted. It's what the Bush administration wanted. Remember, I said I'm an old supply sider. I was there at the beginning. And in 1999, when I was the head of credit strategies at Credit Suisse,
Oh, dang.
I brought in one of the most prominent free market supply side economists. I won't mention his name because it'll embarrass him after the fact. He's a friend. And he told us in a seminar that the United States should not produce anything. We will do the design. We'll do the clean stuff. We'll let everybody else do the dirty work of manufacturing. There's no reason for the United States to have another factory ever again. And we had gigantic trade deficits with China. That's when the trade deficit with China exploded. And chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for Bush, Michael Boskins, gave a talk at Bloomberg, which I attended, in which he said, well, these trade deficits are there because people like our economy so much that they want to put capital into our economy, and to get the money for that capital, they have to sell us goods. So what's happening is a good thing. It shows our strength. So this was a deliberate policy by a bunch of ideologues who took David Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage and turned it into a crazy-ass cartoon version, which led us into this mess. So yes, we let the Chinese into the WTO, but this is a self-inflicted wound. Now, from the Chinese standpoint, why do the Chinese want to export all this stuff to us? Why not just build stuff and sell it to their own people? And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. Jack, the first is by having to produce for the world market, the Chinese were forced to come up to speed and maintain high quality standards. If you're a communist state producing crap for your own people, you can get away with the rottenest kind of quality control, as we saw from, say, Russian, Eastern European goods under communism. So it was a great benefit to them to have the discipline. Secondly, because they were a poor and fragile economy, they wanted foreign exchange reserves. They now $1 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. So that we thought that benefited us. It certainly benefited China. But what happened, which we really missed, it's not so much that light bulb factories left Schenectady and went to Wuhan. That's not what scares me. Because, frankly, making light bulbs or making screws or T-shirts is not going to be the highest paid kind of work, the kind of that'll pay the kind of salary that'll support an American family of four these days. What scares me is starting about 10 years ago, the Chinese reach critical mass. It's like the machines becoming sentient. They decided we have the capacity to take the Americans and dominate high tech trade. Now, remember, China is a country of 1.4 billion people. When we fought Japan in 1941, Japan had half our population and a quarter of our GDP. China has 4.5 times our population, and depending on how you measure it, it has almost our GDP or a bit more than our GDP. When I say depending on how you measure it, Last time I flew to Chengdu in Western China, the taxi ride from the airport to downtown was about half an hour, cost me $6. So a dollar goes a lot farther in Chinese pricing. So if you use what's called purchasing power parity, China's already the biggest economy in the world. And the most important thing is in the generation, remember, China got to be a big economy by turning subsistence farmers into factory workers. That was what Deng Xiaoping, the visionary premier of China, starting in the late 70s, undertook. And they moved 600 million people from countryside to city, biggest migration in world history. And that they became a dominant manufacturer of middle of the range products. Their objective now is to move into the high-tech space, to dominate robotics. They already dominate 5G telecommunications. Huawei is still the biggest telecommunications infrastructure company in the world. But just building the boxes that give you very fast and very responsive broadband is not the only element of this, or the most important. Jack, think of 5G broadband as like the railroads of the 19th century. People didn't make a lot of money in railroads. Most of them went bankrupt. But once you had the railroad, you could do 100 other things that weren't possible before. You could produce a vast food surplus in Nebraska and sell it in Pennsylvania. Once you could created a market for farm equipment and machinery and steel and everything like it. And the railroad, by cheapening the cost of transport and making long-distance transport of food possible, launched the Great American Revolution, which made us the dominant industrial power in the world. 5G is the carrier technology for dozens of other things, and that's the main subject of my book, You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. Now, while we have watched China put massive resources in a high-tech industry, we are simply not investing in our own industry. Donald Trump, I give him total credit for seeing a problem and being passionate about doing something about it. But Trump thought the answer was tariffs on China. Well, we put the tariffs on China in August 2019. And at that point, our imports from China annualized were about $410 billion a year. As of April, our imports from China were more like $675 billion a year. So more than half again as much. The tariffs didn't work. Nothing is going to work except a concerted industrial policy which pushes capital into high-tech investment, gets workers trained for the right kind of jobs, and tariffs have a minor role in protecting us from dumping, but that's basically what we need.
As my focus at the School of Foreign Service was on Latin America. My dream was to be an emerging market fixed income trader. And it was an obscure thing to want to get into, but I loved it. And I just loved Latin America. I traveled all over the place, and economics degree from George Mason, and wanted to be in finance. All these things came together. And I do remember studying import substitution industrialization policies. And their idea then was to put up giant tariffs, giant trade barriers, so that foreign products were too expensive for domestic markets to purchase, which would then allow space for the domestic manufacturers to grow and develop and to get up to speed, basically. And then that was the theory, right? And it didn't necessarily work. It didn't work out that well. And, I thought that if you were going to go that direction, instead of just protecting us against dumping, but, with the Chinese steel tariffs, but like to try to actually incentivize and make space for reindustrialization of the United States, that you had to go way farther than they did. And without the concomitant or concurrent, really thoughtful, forward-thinking, forceful industrial policy, the goal wasn't going to be met. Do you know what the obstacle was or is to that type of forward-thinking, muscular industrial policy that's nationally that's tied directly to our national security. How is it that we forgot that if you can build cars, you can build tanks, and if you can build tanks, you can wage war? How did we forget that, basically, if you apply that all across the board? And what was the failure there, and what would your remedy be?
Well, we won the Cold War and we decided we were king of the world forever and we could get lazy. I think that's the main thing that happened. To win the Cold War, we created technologies that were war winning. All the avionics that we put into American aircraft and superior, Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which never became practical but represented a serious threat. The use of microelectronics in defense, smart weapons, all these things we all developed in the 70s and 80s and persuaded the Russians that they should not try to fight a war with us because they were guaranteed to lose it. So they folded without firing a shot, which is one of the great victories of all times. At that point, we stopped putting federal money into weapons because we didn't have to, and we got a bunch of do-gooders and peaceniks and social welfare types running American foreign policy, starting with the Clinton administration. And then the Bushies came in, and the Bushies were in the grip of a distorted sort of academic free market ideology. I'm a free market guy, but their common sense has to temper it. And they went off the rails as far as common sense was concerned and landed us in the mess that we're in. One of the biggest problems we have, I mean, defense and industry go together, just as you said. How do you get industries to innovate? Nobody likes to innovate. Everybody likes, if I could be General Mills and sell exactly the same cornflakes, or Procter and Gamble and sell the same, gallon of Tide, year in, year out, and establish a monopoly with consumers. Just sit there and clip coupons. You don't have to do anything. Where you get massive industrial innovation is often when you have a military need for it. Where did we get the graphic user interface, fast and light computer chips, optical networks that make the internet possible, the internet itself? Every single one of them came, or started at least, I should say, with a project from the Defense Department, which had a military need for that. Now, often the Defense Department project took on a life of its own and came up with something totally different. My favorite example, told to me by Dr. Henry Crisell, former head of RCA Labs, is about the optical network, which we use for everything. We're talking on an optical network right now. In 1976-77, Defense Department had the idea that they wanted a form of illumination to be able to fight on battlefields at night. So there was some engineer at RCA who had been playing with a semiconductor laser and found a way to get a stable signal from a semiconductor laser. Once they did that, they realized, hey, we can send pulses of light through glass fiber cable that will carry much more information than copper wire, like by a factor of hundreds. That invented the cable television industry. That made the internet possible. It transformed communications. No one anticipated it, but because we were determined to leapfrog the Russians technologically, we put the money behind the basic R&D, and then private money took this and turned it into new companies and new industries. So the lack of a defense driver for civilian technology has been one real killer. I think people talk about how corrupt the Russian army is, and of course it's corrupt, but we have a corruption problem of our own, which is that there's a cozy arrangement between the Defense Department and the defense contractors to sell us the same systems for 30 or 40 years with minor modifications. They don't have to innovate. They don't have to spend at R&D. They don't have to hire people away from Silicon Valley. They get cost plus, and they make tons of money selling us the same obsolete junk. That's one problem. The other problem is once we turned over so much of the supply chain to China, it's very hard to get it back. Now, if you're a manufacturer, you need a whole ecosystem around you. You need the transportation, you need skilled labor, you need engineers, you need repair people, you need parts. If you go to Shenzhen, China, which 40 years ago was a fishing village, is now a city of 25 million people with some of the highest real estate prices in the world. That's the headquarters of Huawei and many of the other tech companies. There is a technology market that's like the size of the Mall of the Americas in Minnesota. And it's nothing but small companies who make electronic parts. So if you want any kind of electronic part at all for a factory in Shenzhen, there are 20 people who'll give you a bid in 10 seconds and send it over on the back of a motorbike. You don't even have to go there. So the efficiency of manufacturing, given the density of the support for it in China, is enormous. You want to start a factory. Tim Cook of Apple has said, I can't make an iPhone here. Don't have the process engineers, don't have the parts, don't have anything. Foxconn talked about setting up a plant in Wisconsin. They broke ground, looked around, and gave it up because the ecosystem isn't there. You need the critical mass of support services to run successful manufacturing. And once we give that up, manufacturers will say, gee, I'd love to manufacture in the United States, but I just don't have the facilities and support here. If I go to China, everything's there. Plus, and this is a big plus, the local government's going to write me a check to help build my factory. Because the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans subsidize factories the way we subsidize football stadiums.
Mm. It helps when you're a mercantilist economy, stacking up gold and cash and having a huge capital surplus that you can use to push your foreign and your industrial policy and then drive your world domination goals. It's almost as if they've outplayed us.
Well, they've outplayed us. It's been a long grind. It's like the tortoise overtaking the hare.
Yeah.
We're better at innovation than they are. We're better at everything than they are. But what we don't have is the long range planning and the persistence. They're plotters, and they're very dependent on our technology for many things, although frighteningly, their dependence is diminishing. They're beginning to develop some of their own technology. I have no doubt that if the United States really put its resources behind industrial innovation the way we did, say, in World War II, or during the space race, during the Kennedy moonshot period, or in the Reagan administration with the Strategic Defense Initiative, if we did that, we would leapfrog the Chinese in critical areas. China's going to be a huge economy and a major world player, whatever we do. I don't think that it's realistic to think of stopping them from becoming a bigger economy or stopping them from developing technology. Well, we can stay a couple of steps ahead of them.
Do you think that the nature of warfare has changed possibly such that the spillover positive effects of a military-led innovation ecosystem would be less so in the past? And I ask this because it seems to me that big land-based confrontations are a thing of the past, that we are operating more in a decentralized capacity, more in an information capacity, more with small, nimble forces in and out, rather than, shipping, 500,000 men across the sea and whatnot. Is the nature of military conflict such still that the positive spillover effects from innovation led in that industry would be as effective and prevalent as they were in the past?
That's a terrific question, and I really don't know how to answer it. I'm not if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war at the moment, a European military analyst told me the problem the Russians had is that it's been so long since anybody fought a conventional war, they had to have people relearn how to do it. And what the Russians are doing is really exactly what they did in World War II, using infantry to encircle and pocket the other side so they can use the artillery to finish them. So that hasn't changed very much. But to the extent, Jack, that artificial intelligence is a critical issue for the military, I mean, obviously is. For example, as you know, an airframe can now fly much faster, twice as fast at least, as a human pilot can stand it. There'd be too many G's, but you can build drones which can fly twice as fast as an F-35 or an F-18. If you are able to coordinate the drones in drone swarms, you may be able to replace manned aircraft entirely. No prejudice to Tom Cruise in his new movie, but that very well might be the way things are going. And I think the spin-off applications for drone swarms would be enormous. Another critical area for military technology, which has many civilian implications, is directed energy weapons. As I'm sure you've seen, the Israelis have a laser cannon, which is used to take out mortar shells or light drones. Drones fly slowly, so it's not that hard to focus the laser on it for the time it needs to burn through the skin and destroy it. But when you're dealing with things, new kinds of missiles like hypervelocity glide vehicles, this is not just an ICBM. An ICBM is hard enough to shoot down, even when you know exactly where it's going to go, because it has a deterministic path. You fire it, and the laws of physics take over, and Newton's dynamics tell you exactly where it's going to be and where it's going to land. That's tough to shoot down, but a hypervelocity missile goes near the surface, and it can swirl around and change its path, which makes it, at this point, completely impossible to stop by any kind of system we have. Now, if you have directed energy weapons, which can transmit pulse of energy at the speed of light, well, yes, you can take out hypervelocity glide vehicles. And this is not an academic question. The Russians have a submarine-launched HGV, which they've tested in public, and no one's disputed the results of the test. They could have a submarine lurking underwater 100 miles outside of Washington, push a button, and deliver a nuclear weapon in about 90 seconds. That's pretty frightening. So directed energy weapons, that would have enormous spin-offs. The requirements of computation for targeting such weapons are enormous. We need entirely new algorithms. We need artificial intelligence to predict the path of these squirrely new kinds of missiles that are maybe coming at us, God forbid. We would need different kinds of, probably advances in physics to get the right kind of directed energy. I mean, the laser, which we take for granted, is practically speaking a very new thing. As I mentioned, we only got the semiconductor laser, which makes optical networks possible, in the late 1970s. So the idea that the development of directed energy physics has come to an end, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I think there are an enormous number of areas where we have an urgent military need to do the R&D, to protect ourselves, and to respond to advances in weapons that our potential enemies have already developed and leapfrogged us. And we have civilian spin-offs, which are easy to envision from these things. So I don't believe that the dual-use technology concept is obsolete, to answer your question finally.
Yeah. It really, I told you pre-show I wanted to talk about Angelo Codevilla. He was an amazing man, and maybe you can introduce some of him as you talk about this next question. But in his posthumously published book. Oh, the name's escaping me right now, but it's about the rise and fall of America in foreign policy. And it's about American foreign policy decision making, its statesmanship, its divergence from the Monroe Doctrine. But one of the things that he talks about very specifically in there is a lack of missile defense, strategic missile defense. And uh, I don't know of anybody who's more an expert on this subject. So Angelo, so I'm taking what he wrote as being true. But apparently, we have one missile defense site in Alaska that is designed to defend against tactical missiles, but not against strategic ones, and that this was a conscious and concerted foreign policy decision that was made, I believe, by the Kissinger administration or foreign policy administration or around that time, where we just basically decided that we're just not going to defend against incoming strategic missile launches. Now, it seems to me, maybe we can talk about whether that's true or not, but it seems to me what you're talking about here is if we did focus on this type of technology, then that would have tremendous spillover effects into our economy and be a net benefit to us as society, not only just national security, but industrial, economic, jobs, all the things.
Back in 1983, I was asked to write a short memo for the National Security Council by Norman Bailey, who was then head of economics there, on possible civilian spin-offs for the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I researched it. It wasn't the best piece of work I ever did, but I was convinced that the spin-offs were enormous. Now, Angelo, who I had the honor to know and to befriend, sadly died last year, he was a triple threat. He was a physicist by training. He was a military and military intelligence officer who served as the senior counsel for the Senate Intelligence Committee and therefore had an insider's view of the entire wretched process of our misnamed intelligence community, of which he was a great critic. And third, he was a classical scholar and historian with an enormous breadth of knowledge and insight about world history and politics. And he always believed that it was the great tragedy of the United States that after Reagan introduced the idea of strategic defense, that the whole idea got shelved after the end of the Cold War. When the Clinton administration came in, after communism fell, said, well, why bother? This is a peace dividend. Why don't we spend it on welfare? Why don't we spend it on foreign aid or, whatever nice things we want? We'll never have to fight anybody ever again. Angelo was a great believer in space-based defense. It's an enormously expensive thing. But as he believed, and I firmly believe, just as in the case of the digital revolution, which started with defense subsidies for basic R&D, this kind of national effort for our own protection would pay for itself many times over. There was an estimate done by Chase Econometrics years ago that for every dollar NASA spent on the space program, $9 came back to the economy through increased growth due to the technologies that NASA had developed. Now, Angelo was a visionary there and campaigned for this in what was a very unreceptive environment for the last 30 years of his life. Angelo wrote the best book on foreign policy I've ever read. It's called To Make and Preserve the Peace. And his book on John Quincy Adams is the successor to that. And his argument is that the United States needs to be exactly what Adams said, a friend of liberty everywhere, but a guardian only of our own. We don't need to export democracy. We don't need to have 800 military bases around the world. We don't need to fight wars of national transformation and democratization. to make the world safe for democracy. These are all drains on our resources. They do more harm than good. We should concentrate on strengthening the United States. As a matter of fact, that's how I met Angelo. I reviewed that book 10 years ago for Claremont Review of Books. We subsequently did a panel discussion together and met on the panel and became good friends. So this kind of insight is remarkably absent from what some people call the blob, the American foreign policy establishment. There's no serious discussion of a really intensive program for missile defense going on in Washington right now in either party. And how that could have happened from the days when Ronald Reagan won the Cold War by merely gesturing in that direction and starting some R&D, to today, where we've been humiliated in Afghanistan and are shortly to be humiliated in Ukraine. How we sunk that far, and I stand back and look at it, I'm astonished.
Not leaving me with a super warm, fuzzy feeling, this conversation, but unfortunately, I think that is where we are. I mean, certainly there are areas in our life where we can see some positive change, but when you look at the entire global perspective, our relationship with other nations, our lack of focus on the appropriate military initiatives, the decimation of our industrial base, it's looking tough. And I can't imagine a right-wing candidate today, a Republican candidate, coming out and saying that we need to put defense first 100%, not just, oh, we need a strong military, but like, we need to invest trillions of dollars in new technology and build this whole new global space-based strategic initiative. We need to have laser cannons lining the East Coast to prevent against sub-launched nuclear attacks, because Russia is involved in an existential war right now where if things escalate, they're probably going to do some level of nuclear detonation. People would be like, this is the guy who's going to be the Hitler. Right? Like there's no space for that.
Well, you have a lot of vested interest who wouldn't like it. To start with, the defense contractors wouldn't like it because you're basically saying we don't, frankly, most of what you're doing is obsolete. We don't need it anymore. You're going to have to spend a lot of money to make new stuff, and that's not the most profitable thing for them to do. Right now, everybody in this business knows that aircraft carriers cannot defend against large numbers of surface-to-ship missiles. One of the most interesting things that happened in the Ukraine war is that the Ukrainians sank the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva, probably sunk with either a British, American Harpoon missile or a new Norwegian missile, as we reported in Asia Times, tracked by satellite or by a P-8 reconnaissance plane. So there was basically a real-time downlink of positioning information on the ship that allowed the missile, fired from over 100 kilometers away, to skim the surface, evade Russian defenses, and destroy the ship. If the Ukrainians can do that to the Russians, the Chinese can do it to us. So, for years, 50 years, the backbone of our global power projection has been aircraft carriers, aircraft carrier battle groups. And if the Chinese have well over 1,000 surface-to-ship missiles, even if we can shoot down a few of them with the existing anti-missile systems on carriers like the Aegis defense system, they can be swamped. And the new hypervelocity glide vehicles, we've got nothing to stop them. So we've got to stop building aircraft carriers. And that will rub up against massive amounts of vested interest in the Pentagon. To give it a quick historical parallel, every military in the world in 1940 thought that the battleship was their most important weapon system. Then the British sank the Bismarck and the Gneisenau. The Japanese sank the Repulse and the Prince of Wales near Singapore. The Japanese wiped out American battleships at Pearl Harbor. And all of a sudden, we realized that a dirt cheap torpedo plane or dive bomber could wipe out the most expensive systems in the world, and not a single keel was laid ever again for a battleship in history. 1 year, that was it. But it took massive losses to do it. Now, God forbid that we have to lose a couple of aircraft carriers to Chinese missiles before we figure this out. But typically, that's how backward and conservative and hidebound militaries tend to be, how resistant to innovation. So you'll have a lot of people, if you want to do something like this, saying, not just that you're a warmonger, but you're breaking my rice bowl. The only way it could happen, I had the privilege to work for a man named Andrew Marshall, who was head of the Office of Net Assessment at Pentagon for 50 years. He was a legend in the defense business. And I asked him, when Donald Trump came in, I organized a meeting with some of Trump's aides for him. And I said, how can this get done? He said, there's only one way to do it. You need a president and a secretary of defense who will just steamroll all the opposition they're going to get. Now, much as I supported Donald Trump, I voted for him twice. I wrote numerous articles defending him against what I thought were nefarious deep state attacks against him. But Trump didn't even have a real science advisor. One of the things that made Ronald Reagan so effective is that he had a close friendship with one of the great physicists of his age, Dr. Edward Teller, the head of Lawrence Livermore Labs. Teller was the one who convinced him that Strategic Defense Initiative was possible. And you had the best scientists in the world working with the Reagan administration on this. Trump has many good qualities, but one of them is not an appreciation of science, didn't have anybody advising him on these things. For a while, Steve Bannon was interested, and I advised Steve Bannon and brought some people to meet him in the first year of the Reagan administration. Then Steve got fired, and there really was no one else who cared about it.
It's going to take somebody with a lot of balls who's going to be able to stand up to all of these entrenched interests, the most entrenched interests in our country, pretty much.
I'm hopeful for Ron DeSantis. I think Ron DeSantis has the youth and dynamism and open mind and smart people around him to do this kind of thing. Much as I said, I supported Trump in 2 elections. I don't think he's the right person for the job. I don't think he understands this well enough, and he's burdened with too many mistakes. And I know he has a lot of support. Many of your listeners won't like me saying this, but Trump's approach to China, which is let's beat him up with tariffs, simply was a failure.
Yeah.
It was well intended. It sounded good. It didn't work. I don't see that Trump has the kind of fresh ideas or the ability to learn that a Ronald Reagan had at his age. I'd much rather see someone like DeSantis, a younger person who could be a Republican Kennedy, who can point at the moon and say, we're going to go there.
Right. I agree. And, I supported Trump in both elections, but never really carried water for him and have been openly critical of the things that should have been criticized. And, I haven't taken an official position yet on DeSantis v. Trump. I kind of hope it doesn't come down to that. I really don't want to see a primary there, but DeSantis is doing a lot of good things and demonstrating the muscularity that I think a lot of us are looking for. I want to transition just a little bit here to making our way towards Russia. You talked about the growth of the Chinese industrial base. You talked about, or we didn't talk about it, but there is their worldwide expansion with the Belt Road and all of the infrastructure that they've been putting into place all around the world, ports and airports and industrial investments all over, and bringing in new nations into their fold. And as somebody who's a student of networks and myself, the way network power grows, to what extent is this scenario I'm going to lay out here reasonable as framing? It seems to me that the China, Russia, and everyone else that wants to participate in that network has gotten to a critical mass such that threat of sanctions, the effect of sanctions, the threat of disconnection, being kicked out of the G20, hell, removal from the UN Security Council threats, any of these things, none of them really mean anything anymore because the Russia China network universe is at least on a path, if not already, but on a path towards being big enough, large enough, sufficient enough that if they cut Russia out of the West, of the G20, and they just engage with all these other countries, they'd be totally fine. If that's true or not, what does that mean for our future of our foreign policy interactions and military interactions with Russia?
Well, first of all, it would mean that our fantasies about crushing Russia, as expressed by President Biden April 4th, when he tweeted that we've reduced the ruble to rubble and we're going to cut the size of the Russian economy in half, are just that, fantasies. The Biden administration thought they were well underway to getting Putin thrown out of power and disabling Russia forever as a military power, as Lord Austin said in Kiev at the beginning of April. It's not going to happen. The Chinese are being very cautious about this, by the way. The Chinese view is Napoleon's, who said, don't interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake. So they're just letting this play out and enjoying themselves. Russia has relatively limited needs in terms of technology inputs, and they're getting them under the door through all kinds of different means. The Indians are still trading up a storm with China. India's one of the world's largest economies. That's possibly the most important strategic consequence of this Ukraine war, that India fell off the bandwagon. They have China, they have many other people. The majority of all the world's countries refuse to put sanctions on Russia. The idea that Russia was a fading power has been somewhat tempered by the fact that they learned pretty quickly how to go back to doing what they used to do in World War II, and they're not doing so badly in Ukraine. As a matter of fact, at this point, they appear to be winning within certain limited parameters. And the fact that we announced we're going to crush Russia, reduce them as a power, destroy their economy, makes us look like complete idiots and wrecks our credibility. Now, everyone's scrambling to try to find a solution. Henry Kissinger came out in Davos and basically says, go back to status quo ante, which means Ukraine gives up territory, to which Zelensky said, we never will, well, until he runs out of people and bullets. A lot of people are talking about some kind of negotiated solution all of a sudden. And that, Jack, points to the fact that we were never going to get anything but a negotiated solution. There are Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine. And years ago, we could have done what the Czechs and Slovaks did. Remember, there used to be a thing called Czechoslovakia? Now there's a Czech Republic and a Slovak Republic, and they're independent from each other. And guess how they did it? They voted on it, and they decided to have a divorce. No one got beaten up, let alone shot. There are ways to do this when you have peoples who don't quite get along, have cultural differences and different gravitational pulls to different states. Could have done this years ago. I wrote a piece in 2008 proposing this. But instead, the geniuses who run our foreign policy thought they had an opportunity to settle accounts with Putin and finally bring the great liberal dream of democracy to Russia. And they pushed Russia into a corner, and Russia lashed out. I'm not defending Russia, by the way. Putin should have invaded. What he's doing is terrible. But, if I go into a bar and there's an obstreperous drunk and I push him in a corner, and he takes out a gun and shoots me, he's not right to shoot me, but I shouldn't have pushed him into the corner to begin with.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, since the beginning of the invasion, I've laid out all of the reasons why I thought that Russia was rational in their decision making, but always with the caveat, like, yeah, but it's still wrong. and bad, and we don't want people blowing each other up. So, it's possible at once, if you're of a sophisticated mind, to understand the rationale and the reasoning and talk about it without supporting the action that they took. But there's also sort of a fait accompli about it, where we in part made it happen. And I think people on the right get a lot of shit from people on the left because our mutual critique of the American empire is the same. Russia makes the same arguments about why the American empire is flawed, of what do you say, an empire of lies and all these things. Like, yeah, we've been making the same critique for the last, however many years. And, to hear him say that, you're like, oh, well, I guess it kind of makes sense. But again, blanket disclaimer, invading countries and killing people and destroying cities, not necessarily something that I support. Now, there were early reports out of the on the ground war there that, Ukraine is valiantly fighting off Russia, and they're going to hold, and Russia's going to be defeated. They're going to have to tuck tail and all this. Are you seeing that? I mean, the current status of the war is what? Russia basically grinding it out?
Asia Times does a daily report on Ukraine, curated by our editor-in-chief, Uwe Parpart. Uwe was a senior German military officer, started as a Special Forces guy, highly qualified to process the information. And the way he reads it is that Russia started out making every possible dumb rookie mistake in the book. And it took Putin about 6 to 8 weeks to fire the dumb generals and put in generals who knew what they were doing, at which point U.S. military observers started to tell us, and German military observers, that the Russians now, operating very efficiently, taking fewer casualties, coordinating armor and air and artillery and infantry, and doing a professional job. And given the fact that their advantage in artillery is somewhere between 15 to 1 and 40 to 1, depending on what sources you look at, they're just chopping the Ukrainians up gradually. Ukrainians are now losing 200 soldiers a day killed, according to their own sources. That probably means 4 times as many injured, not to mention POWs. So they're losing, 600-700 people a day. How long can a country with a fairly small population of military-age men keep this up? They're also running out of ammunition. They have Soviet-era weapons, Soviet-era ammo, and they don't have enough of it. And they're getting some American weapons, and it's easy to say, "Oh yes, get all these American weapons to them." The problem is, in the midst of a shooting war with Russian artillery targeting roads and destroying railroads, it's not so easy to bring in heavy equipment at this point. So the Ukrainians are getting ground down. At some point, they very well could collapse. The Russians, I don't have a map in front of me, of course, but the Russians are using a classic so-called cauldron or pocket tactic, where you isolate groups of soldiers, surround them, and then pound them to pieces with artillery. Looks like that's what's happened in Severodonetsk, the city in the east of Ukraine in the Donbass region, which has been the focus of fighting in the last couple of weeks. So at some point, we probably have to work out a compromise. Now, considering we said Putin's a war criminal, no compromise is possible, we're going to reduce Russia to the point that it can't fight anymore and cut its economy in half, make it insignificant. We then turn around and say, okay, Putin's going to have to get some of what he wants. It makes us look like real losers, real bozos. But the degree of, the extent which people drank the Kool-Aid on this, Jack, was just amazing. I was at a conclave at a major think tank under Chatham House rules. I was giving a talk on China, but in there were former cabinet members who I can't name, but people who are household names. One of them said, people are talking about giving Putin an off-ramp. He's going downhill in a car headed towards a brick wall. We should keep him there and let him crash. Okay, this is the beginning of April, when the Russians had made a bunch of mistakes. I wonder what he thinks now. That was a consensus across Republicans and Democrats. Only a few right-wing loonies like you and me had some qualms about this. Now we're going to end up with a major strategic setback, a major embarrassment.
David. I'm still with you, David. Question for you. When you mention the word off-ramp, I mean, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I mean, don't we want to find a way for this thing to work itself out without us pushing for regime change, without us pushing for denuclearization of Russia, without us pushing them towards some sort of existential, demise that I don't think that they're going to respond to well?
Off-ramp in this context meant let's give him an honorable way out to get a ceasefire and a compromise, as opposed to regime change and so forth. That meant a compromise. Whether we like it or not, the fact is we lacked the power to stop Putin from doing that. This is what really enrages me. As I said, I'm an old Ronald Reagan hawk. I believe in peace through strength. This was provocation from weakness. NATO didn't have a single unit above battalion size to oppose to the Russian army. The Germans, who had 1.2 million men under arms in 1990 when communism fell, have maybe 200,000 now, and maybe 100 operational tanks. The French have a slightly bigger army, but I'm told reliably they've got 1 week's worth of ammunition. So the Europeans have nothing. We had no combat troops on the ground. We're now putting some combat troops in Europe well after the fact. Meanwhile, the Russians have hypervelocity glide vehicles, as I mentioned, which we don't. No defense against them. They also have, as Angelo Codevilla pointed out, a layered anti-missile defense for their major cities. The Russians have little tactical missiles, anti-missile missiles, with small nuclear warheads. If we shot an ICBM at Moscow with a nuclear warhead, they'd send up a bunch of smaller missiles and detonate nuclear weapons in space to blow up our missile. Don't have to hit it exactly, just have to be within a mile of it or whatever. So the Russians have a very good air defense system, which we don't. So how are we going to get into a scrap with them? We don't have the troops on the ground. We don't have the same offensive weapons. We don't have the same defensive weapons. What we've got is Switchblade drones, Stinger missiles, Javelin anti-tank systems, which is nice, but they're not going to make the difference here.
I guess you have to have a position of strength to build the off-ramp. We don't even have that. So we are takers in this scenario rather than givers. And I don't think the American people, American foreign policy establishment, anyone involved has swallowed that fact, yeah?
Well, that's the embarrassment. We hate being humiliated, but that's what's going to end up doing because we didn't make the preparations. As I said, I'm a hawk. I want everyone to be terrified of us. Yeah. That way, they'll behave themselves.
Yeah.
I would like the Germans to reintroduce the draft and have 1 million men under arms.
Well, that's probably a podcast in and of itself. That question right there. Trying to process all this information. I mean, it's kind of scary. It is just yet another checkpoint in the diminishment of the American power, American prestige. And we're going through a period of cognitive dissonance where we believe that we have the power to do one thing and act in a certain way. And the reality of it is smacking us in the face. So what is the end? How does this play out? Right? How does, in your mind, how does the Russia-Ukraine situation play out? And what does it do for China's perception of us and then their foreign policy as well too?
Well, China thinks we're idiots. China has a lot of its own problems. Remember, China is, I mentioned they're exporting $675 billion a year of goods to us. That's a lot of jobs for Chinese. To turn that around, they don't want us to collapse, at least not soon. We're one of their best markets. Asia is their biggest market, but we're number 2, and that's important to them. So China wants to gradually shift away from export dependence in the U.S. In fact, they're much less dependent than they were under the Bush administration in the 2000s, but they want to become even less dependent. China wants to gradually accumulate power in a way that makes their power irreversible. They don't like the Russians. They think Putin's a hothead. They're not pleased that he invaded Ukraine. They would have advised him not to, I believe. Because the Chinese never like to fight for stuff they can get without a fight. And so far, they're getting everything they want without a fight, so why shouldn't they continue?
It's a fundamental Chinese warfare philosophy, isn't it?
Remember, the Chinese are not patriots. They're not a country. They're an empire. Nobody likes the empire, the emperor, not like the Japanese with their bonsai long live the emperor thing. Chinese look at the emperor like the capo di tutti capi. He's the guy who's there to prevent the underbosses from killing each other and making too much trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So they're interested in their own families and their own business, and the state is a convenience to help them meet personal goals. So nobody wants to die for the emperor or die for China if they can possibly avoid it. The Chinese don't want a war. But I think what will happen is that the United States will continue to lose ground to China in basic industry. And at some point, we're going to see the world tire of buying our paper in return for their goods. And that means there's going to be a substantial drop in American living standards.
You're teeing up my very next question, but I want to go back and drill down 1 second before we get to just the credit situation in America. What is the end game in Ukraine? What do you see as being the conclusion, if there is one, and then what does Russia do even perhaps after that?
Ukraine is going to be a very sad place. Remember, Ukraine notionally had, I think, 45 million people.
Yep.
But 12 million of them had already left the country before the war. Half the working age adult population had moved out of Ukraine, was working everywhere from Poland to the United Kingdom because the jobs weren't there. It was a corrupt, rotten, poor place. 14 million people have been displaced by the war. So you begin to add all these numbers up, you wonder how many people are going to be left, particularly how many working age adults. And then there's $1 trillion worth of damage. Now, $1 trillion, that's in a country whose gross domestic product is $160 billion, so that's 6 times GDP. Try to imagine $120 trillion worth of damage in the United States. Just unimaginable. So I think large parts of Ukraine won't be rebuilt. Cities will be abandoned. Western Ukraine, which is mainly agriculture, will continue to grow wheat, but it'll be a much poorer and sparsely settled country. They also have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And when Putin said, my objectives are to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, what Putin will say is we accomplish those objectives. We destroy the Azov battalion in Mariupol. That's the so-called Nazis, and some of them actually are Nazis, or were. Most of them are dead. And we demilitarized it. Demilitarized it is we reduced the army to a point where it can't fight effectively. And if they keep grinding them up for another 4 to 6 months, that probably will happen. So Putin will say, fine, we have our objectives. We don't want to occupy all of Ukraine. We're going to incorporate either as independent republics or part of Russia, the Russian-speaking areas in the Donbass, and that's going to be it. We take those, and the rest of it, you're going to make an agreement. You're not going to join NATO. No Western missiles will be stationed there that can be pointed at Russia, or we come back in, and you get some kind of deal like that. One thing that's been floated around is a Korean kind of situation. North Korea and South Korea don't have a peace treaty, but they haven't been shooting each other for 72 years. That's a possibility. We'll see. Russia will be more part of the Chinese orbit. Now, the interesting thing is, what do we do about sanctions? These sanctions on Russia have been an own goal. Russia's making more money than it was before the war, selling oil and gas. They're selling oil and gas, they're selling oil rather, to Russia and to India and China at a discount, $35, $40 a barrel, so basically the same price as before the war or a lower price. Guess who gets to pay the $125 a barrel price and $5 or $6 at the pump? Suckers like us.
That's right.
We get stuck with the bill. So, I mean, we're just, the Biden administration sanctions aren't hurting Russia. They're making as much money as they used to, or even more. They're a great benefit to Russia and to India and China, who are getting all this cheap oil from Russia, and we're paying top dollar. How do you like them apples?
Yeah, no,
so
dismal.
It's just incredibly stupid. Whoever figured this out really ought to get, be made to spend the rest of the Biden administration sitting with a dunce cap in the corner.
Yeah. Not to defend them by any means, but I mean, that was the playbook, right? You do something bad, we slap sanctions. It was the playbook. They just didn't do what it was supposed to because the world is different. The world is different, and now we're paying for it. And I can't see a scenario. I'm hoping it will come, but I can't see a scenario in which the Biden administration walks back the sanctions. Right? Like, how do they? What story do they tell the American people to save face and pull back the sanctions at the same time?
That I've wondered that myself, and I've asked people around the administration, but no one's given me an answer yet. They really kind of painted themselves into a corner, didn't they?
Yeah. Do Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Bulgaria, Poland, should they be nervous about what happens once Russia's done with Ukraine?
Well, they should be nervous, but I don't think Russia is going to take the Baltic states. There isn't a lot there they want. The Baltic states can't be used as a platform for missiles against them. For one thing, they're close to St. Petersburg, but very far from Moscow. Secondly, you look at the map of the Baltic states, you have this bulge there called Kaliningrad, which is a giant Russian military base right in the middle there. They can't be resupplied because you've got Belarus on one side. There's only a narrow corridor of Poland that can reach the Baltic states. So they're kind of under a gun. As for the Poles, well, they've been occupied by the Russians lots of time. To the extent that, the Poles may be paranoid about the Russians, but even paranoids have real enemies. And the Poles have a right to be nervous. So the Polish position in this has been to encourage the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. The Poles hate the Ukrainians only slightly less than they hate the Russians. During World War II, there were massacres of Poles by Ukrainians on the border, the fluid and imprecise border of those two countries. So they're happy to have the Ukrainians bleed to death, killing Russians. They don't like either of them. I think that's been a cynical policy on the part of the Poles. When it comes down to it, Poland is a NATO member. If Russia attacks Poland, we're at war with Russia. That would be a very big threshold for Russia to cross. I don't believe they have any reason to do it currently. And I think we should have sufficient deterrent to make them not want to cross it. That's a big difference. So yes, the Poles will always be nervous, but I don't believe that a Russian invasion of Poland is imminent, whatever happens in Ukraine.
Well, that's good. At least there's that. Let's transition. What do you make of the U.S. dollar? Where is the U.S. dollar going? Where are interest rates going? What is up with inflation? I can't make heads or tails of it. My traditional macroeconomic training seems to be totally inapplicable. There's gazillions of dollars of people chasing real negative yields in U.S. treasuries. No reflection of real inflation rates in the yield curve at any point on the curve. What do you make?
Well, let me make one observation, which I think is telling. I've published charts about this many times. You look at the price of insurance against the collapse of the U.S. dollar. There are only limited number of things you can buy. One is gold. The other, of course, is inflation-protected securities. Treasury inflation-protected securities are TIPS. They're indexed to the inflation rate. So if you buy a 5-year TIPS with a principal of 100, price of 100, and the inflation is 30% over the next 5 years, you get back $130 in principal at the end of the 5 years when it becomes due. Now, for the last 15 years, TIPS and gold have traded almost exactly the same way. They're both an insurance policy. But the interesting thing is that this year, gold has hardly fallen. It has fallen slightly, while TIPS have moved 250 basis points, 2.5 percentage points, biggest move ever in anticipation of Fed tightening. And what that tells me is people don't trust insurance against the U.S. dollar issued by the U.S. government. It's like buying life insurance from the captain of the Titanic. They'd much rather buy something which is completely independent of the United States, like gold. So what this says is that the risks attached to the U.S. dollar are the highest they've ever been. The relative price of TIPS and gold, that relationship has just gone off the charts, much worse than in 2008. So the fact that the price of risk or the cost of insurance has gone through the ceiling doesn't mean we're going to have a crisis. Same way, if you come into an insurance company, doctor, and you're 100 pounds overweight and you smoke 8 packs a day and so forth, they say, okay, your insurance is going to cost you the following. That doesn't mean you're going to die soon, but it does mean you've got a big risk of dying soon.
Yeah.
So the inflation that we had is clearly the result of $6 trillion worth of stimulus hitting no supply. We simply don't have the supply chains to meet that much demand. So it's like at a bowl game, if there are 5,000 hot dogs and you give out 10,000 vouchers, the value of the voucher is going to go down.
Yeah.
That turned out to be a really lousy idea in retrospect. This massive giveaway during COVID that produced the wave of inflation. So that if that's all there is, eventually that'll dissipate, and that's why you see 8.3% year-on-year inflation, but the 5-year break-even inflation rate is 3%, 4%, whatever, much lower. People see it as a shock for the last couple of years and then dissipate. But given the fact that the United States is borrowing $1 trillion or $2 trillion every year to finance a trade deficit, which keeps going up, we've borrowed net, or borrowed or taken in by selling stock. We have a net foreign asset position of negative $18 trillion. A lot of money. That's the cumulative trade deficit, basically, of the last 30 years. And if our industry keeps deteriorating, and if our tech bubble loses its shine, and our assets don't look as attractive, and people don't want to buy TIPS as a hedge anymore because they don't trust us, at some point we could get a real run out of American assets and a serious decline in living standards. That's a serious risk. Not inevitable, but the way things are going, we're like the guy who's 100 pounds overweight smoking 8 packs a day.
Well, what's your probability assessment of that scenario playing out? And can you describe how the erosion in living standards works its way through the system?
Well, first thing that will happen is if asset prices collapse, investment collapse, you get high unemployment. Secondly, the dollar is going to drop, which means prices will adjust, so we'll have more inflation. Right now, American families are losing I'd guess about 5% a year in spending power in real terms, because I think CPI is worse than the government says it is. I don't think they take rent and housing prices into account adequately. So that's a 5% cut in spending power in a year, which is as bad as it's ever been, 5 or 6% actually. As bad as the Great Recession in 2008. But that could keep on for a few years, and that could add up to a 15-20% cut in spending power, plus you can get more unemployment. So we're talking about a significant decline in living standards as a serious possibility. Not the end of the United States, not a survivalist scenario, but a really miserable scenario where people feel the difference. Right now, cars on the road are what, average of 12 and a half years? People can't afford new ones. People can't afford to move. A lot of people can't afford a new home. People used to be able to take their kids to McDonald's once a week, can't do it. People are hurting. And they could hurt a lot more as this goes on until we learn to produce the way that America used to when it astonished the world.
What would be a policy change or an economic signal to you that would say that this scenario is less likely to play out? Like what would have to happen? What would you have to see to say, okay, this scenario we've just described, its probability of transpiring is now markedly lower?
We'd have to see CapEx in technology pick up considerably. I'd like to see people laying 5G cable. I'd like to see companies using 5G networks to automate factories and automate ports. I'd like to see our infrastructure repaired. I'd like to see the Defense Department start to put money behind the development of high-tech systems that have civilian spin-offs. Almost like, we've got a tax system which penalizes capital-intensive manufacturing investment and rewards capital-light software companies. So I'd like to see the tax system put on an even basis. So there's an incentive for people to invest in manufacturing. I'd like to see us subsidize factories the way we subsidize football stadiums. There are a lot of things we can do. We've done them all before, as a matter of fact. I've said this many times, Jack, but I think that it's less a matter of learning how to fix this than remembering.
Yeah, so, but people forget. People get old, they die, they leave the biz. We've got people advising folks now that don't remember what the Cold War was like. We've got people that don't remember. Just, it happens in our nation's history time and time again. I remember Lincoln writing about how there was no one alive from the Revolution anymore, and because of that, people forgotten how terrible it was to fight a war and kill each other. And this is a real thing. This institutional lack of memory. So we can count on that, perhaps. the forgetting of what to do.
Indeed. So the question remains open.
It does. Not super positive. What's your bull case? You have any bull case at all? Any bull market? Shine me some positive light on the end of this conversation, sir.
Well, I'd like to see the President of the United States go to Rice University in Texas and stand where Jack Kennedy stood when he pointed at the moon and said, "We're going there," and announced the Apollo program. I'd like to see young people galvanized around the idea of what human beings can accomplish and what the United States of America in particular can accomplish, and run off to study calculus and apply to engineering school. When I was a little kid, I'm 70 years old. When I was a little kid and the space program was just getting going, engineers were the ones who got the hot dates on Saturday night. Now, I think America's, in a way, like a big evangelical tent meeting. We get bursts of enthusiasm, then we get drunk, have a hangover, forget about it, we fall off the wagon, then we need another dose of revival. So we need a president who can inspire us and get that revival feeling going again. We had one of the great stock markets in the world under John F. Kennedy. So I think that's what we need. We need an inspiring leader, not this somnolent, senile old slug who, hobbles out of the White House looking like he's about to fall over.
Half jokingly asking, where are my handlers? What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to talk to? I'm not supposed to talk to you. Even if he's just joking around, it's not a good look. And I don't think that he's joking. One last question, because I've been talking about it quite a bit on Twitter. Short, medium term outlook on interest rates. Is there going to be a Volcker shock to quell inflation?
No, there isn't. We have Volcker was a very great man, and he did the right thing. I've written about this, but in a nutshell, the 70s inflation was very different from this one. In the 70s, everybody thought that they should borrow as much as they possibly could and buy hard assets because they'd be paying them back in inflated dollars. Cigar coupon money, one private equity guy told me. So there was a massive amount of bank lending, and that was driving asset price inflation. We have very little bank lending going on now. This inflation is driven by a demand shock and by the lack of supply. In fact, they put in $6 trillion of demand, and our sclerotic, inadequate supply chains couldn't produce the supply. So raising interest rates doesn't do any good. And the way the Fed will find that out is as there is interest rates, they'll push the U.S. towards or into a recession, and then they'll stop raising interest rates. So I think we go up a little bit further from here, but that's it.
Well, I wish I shared your outlook on that. The latest data I saw tells me that we haven't even put 40% of the stimulus money into the economy, right? It's just been legislated and earmarked, but it hasn't actually even been transmitted into the economy. I don't know. There's a part of me that just feels like everything that I'm taking in feels like, that 1981, man, it was a good time to get into fixed income, just like this, all the way down, all the way down, all the way down. And, at some point trends have to change. And
would I buy bonds here? No.
Pardon me?
Would I buy bonds here? No.
Yeah, somebody is. All right. Well, David, thank you very, very much, sir. We covered a lot of territory. We pretty much touched on everything that I wanted to get to. I really appreciate your insights and your experience and your patience in dealing with my questions. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Entirely mutual, Jack. Thank you for having me on your show.
Sure. Where should I send people to follow you and learn more about you?
At David P. Goldman on Twitter.
All right.
Or asiatimes.com.
Fantastic. David P. Goldman, everybody. Deputy editor with the Asia Times, Claremont fellow, former head of credit strategy at Credit Suisse, all kinds of background and fascinating experience to draw on for this analysis. So thank you. I really appreciate it, David, and hopefully we'll catch up another time soon.
I look forward to that. Thank you, Jack.
All right. Excellent. All right, guys, we are out on this one. That is the end of Jack Murphy Live number 91. Really appreciate you tuning in. Hit subscribe on YouTube. Hit subscribe on your podcast apps everywhere. Follow me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. Again, if you're interested in a brotherhood of men looking to increase their sovereignty in the world, personal, financial, land, water, food, information sovereignty, please join us at the Liminal Order. That's liminal-order.com. And until the next time, we are out.